talking about fats. But before we get started, I do just want to mention that Sunny is up here. Her harness and leash, well, the leash was just my lack thereof wanting to mess with it in the cold. Her harness is being washed, so her harness is at home, so she's currently, quote unquote, naked. She doesn't quite understand what's going on, so she looks a little sad. I promise there's nothing wrong with her. She's totally fine. She's been playing completely well with my mom's dog and the dogs at home, and my mom's dog is actually her son, which she could take or leave him. So she's good. She's just kind of trying to figure out what's going on and why she doesn't have her harness on. But she would accept your love nonetheless if you want to come give her love after lecture. She's just chilling right now. And I'll make sure she stays up here so she doesn't make anybody uncomfortable. Any questions before we get started? Okay. Here's our learning objectives. Ooh, I have a question for you all. How was the first case study?
Great.
It was due already, right? Oh, okay, due tonight. Okay, good, because my plan was to grade them on Friday. There's going to be a case study associated with this lecture, so I will post that after my meeting. And how does next Wednesday sound for due date on that? Good? Okay. All right, so lipids, fats that we consume. What are some foods that you guys think of when you hear the words lipids or fats? Avocado, that's not typically the first one that I hear, but that's a good one. Cheese, yeah. Butter. Fried chicken. Milk, yeah. Like tuna? Something in a can? Oh, like,
Nuts.
huh?
You do nuts.
Nuts, yeah. So something in a can that, is it like a fish or like a other type of meat? Yeah, Google it. Okay, so we had fried chicken, milk, cheese, what else? Avocado, nuts, oil. That's a good one. What about like cheeseburgers? Or burgers, I guess, because it said cheese. Say what? Funnel cake. I love a funnel cake. There's something so good about it. My kids always want cotton candy, and I'm like, no, you're missing out. Like, funnel cake is where it's at. Yes. Okay, so lots of foods that contain fat. The composition of fats, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. I'm not sure where this is being all wonky. If it gets to be annoying, I can take it off and just holler at you guys. Fat tends to be insoluble in water. So our carbohydrates like water, except for insoluble fiber. Proteins like water. Fats, on the other hand, tend to repel water. We can see this when you mix oil and vinegar or oil and water, right? You get those globules of the oil that kind of binds together. That's what happens to fat in the system. Okay, so when you eat a high-fat meal, that's kind of what happens inside your digestive system. Is that driving y'all nuts? It's starting to drive me nuts. I don't think I...
A little bit.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was having mic issues at videos. Okay, fats are gonna influence digestion. Do you think it speeds up digestion or slows down digestion? Slows down. Fats are gonna be one of our most complex nutrients to digest, so they do slow down the system because the enzymes and the bile have to be able to penetrate those globules of fats, so it takes a little bit longer. Our body is still efficient, it still does it just fine. Doesn't mean you have to restrict fats or, besides the recommendation that says to restrict fat, but your body can still do it efficiently. Let's see. Fats are going to, or like in consideration of fats, we have to consider what they do to the system and how our body reacts to them when we are providing enteral and parenteral nutrition. So either nutrition by way of the GI system or bypassing the GI system completely, and we'll talk about that as we progress then of course they also influence circulatory health, cardiovascular health, immune function, as well as provide or inhibit certain antioxidants, and we'll talk about some of those differences there. So just as we talked about carbohydrates as being deemed as like the villain nutrient in media, how many of us have heard fats being the villain? Okay, absolutely. What fats specifically? Trans fats. There's another one.
Low density lipids.
Low density lipoproteins, so coming from saturated fats. So trans fat and saturated fats are going to be the two fats that are like the villain fats in media, and we'll talk more on that and what that looks like. Primary function of fats is energy. They are our most energy dense nutrient. For every 1 gram of fat that we consume, you're getting in 9 units of energy or 9 calories. And about 80% of the food and body lipids are in the form of triglycerides. So we'll talk about what that looks like. There's also, individual fatty acids. There's also things like cholesterol and waxes that are important for the system as well. Other functions, insulation. So around all of our organ systems, and you guys know this, there's a layer of fat that serves as protection, serves as a means of insulating our body. Membrane structure. If we think about the cell membrane of all of our cells, what do they consist of? Phospholipid bilayer, right? What are phospholipids? Fats, right? Think about our nervous system. What important part of our central nerves and peripheral nerves need fat? The myelin sheath, right? That's so very important because when is that being developed? Embryologically, during development and young childhood as we progress. So really important for babies, toddlers, infants, pregnant women to get in enough fat for the development of the nervous system. And then of course, without fats in the diet, we can't utilize and appropriately absorb fat soluble vitamins. So we have to have some fat in the diet to be able to do that. Okay, so just like with carbohydrates, there's simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. We have pretty much the same classification for fats as well. We have simple fats and we have compound fats. So our simple fats are going to be those individual fatty acids. We'll talk about saturated versus unsaturated, triglycerols or triglycerides, and then waxes. And then our compound fats are going to be phospholipids, which are found in all of our cell membranes, glycolipids, which are embedded within a lot of the phospholipid bilayer of those cells, and then lipoproteins, same kind of case there. So lipids associated with proteins. All right, our dietary, moving into dietary most specifically. Again, fat is essential for digestion. It influences the rate at which digestion occurs, as well as absorption. Anybody here ever heard of phytochemicals? So phytochemicals, if we break the word down, phyto meaning plants, right? Chemicals meaning plant chemicals. So we're looking at the chemical properties or the basic chemical contribution of plants. Now don't get confused by this. Anybody here ever heard the word antioxidant? Okay, so an antioxidant is a phytochemical. It's like the power part of what the plant gives us. Okay, like lycopene. Anybody ever heard of lycopene? It's in tomatoes. Y'all never heard of lycopene before? It's like an anti-cancer nutrient. Eat your tomatoes, okay? Eat your tomatoes. What about carotene? Okay, there we go. That's a good one. What color fruits and vegetables do we get that from? Orange. What does that help with? Vision. Vision. Why? Vitamin A. It's a precursor for vitamin A, exactly. But it's a phytochemical, okay? So some of those like terms that you've already heard, except for lycopene. I'm not sure why you guys haven't heard lycopene. I feel like that one's pretty common. Those are what we refer to as phytochemicals or phytonutrients. So just plant nutrients or plant chemicals that are more powerful or have health benefits associated with them. your homework. If you can consume ice cream, then when the next time you're at the grocery store, well, it's kind of expensive, so don't let it like break the bank. Buy Homestead Creamery ice cream if you've never had it, and you can have like full fat ice cream. It's so good. It's not like the best out there that exists, but it's pretty good. And compare it to, what was that, the Halo ice cream? Do you guys remember that? It's still out there. It's still out there, but it's like ice chips. It's like flavored ice chips. No offense, not my jam. If I'm gonna eat ice cream, I'm going all in, like diving in. And you'll taste the difference in what something that is heavenly and pure and just full of fat versus something that is just mutilated and broken down and just there for visual appearance, I think. No shame. But that's a really good kind of representation of like comparing that. Well, here's another good one. Who here, and this is okay if you do, it's no shame, whatever. Fat-free salad dressing. Can you taste it? Okay, here's your next assignment. Compare ranch, regular ranch, to fat-free ranch. It's just not, it's no good, okay? The reason being is because when you pull the fat out, what do you have to replace it with? Sugar. Why? Because you have to make society think that it tastes okay? Because it's not accepted by society if you take all of the flavor out. Nobody's gonna buy it. So a lot of times if you look at the labels and you see something that's low fat or no fat, check the sugar content because they've just loaded it with sugar to try to give it some flavor back because that's where the flavor is in the fat. So those are your two homework assignments at some point this semester. Just report back and let me know what you think. Okay, so we talked about major form of dietary fat is triglycerides. 80% of foods and body lipids are triglycerides. We're going to talk about saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. Of course, we went through some of those other examples as well. Okay, so as we move into saturated, and I know Dr. May, you did a really good job of this. What's the difference between saturated fat and unsaturated fat? Double bonds, right? The degree of saturation, how many exist, so on and so forth. So with our saturated fat, there's no double bonds. They're all everything is completely saturated. They can't take any more. As we move into monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, you're just looking at the number of double bonds that exist. Now with saturated fat is typically solid at room temperature, okay? So this is gonna be a lot of the fats that are present in animal products. So chicken, steak, pork, so on and so forth, as well as tropical fats. So something like coconut oil is got a whole lot of saturated fat in it. Unsure as to how animal products are solid at room temperature. If you've ever cooked a piece of chicken or steak or a cheeseburger and put it in a Tupperware and let it sit at room temperature or put it in the fridge and then you take it out and you see that film on the bottom of the Tupperware. What is that film? Fat. That's the saturated fat. So that's the solid part at room temperature. Whereas if you take like olive oil or nut butter or peanut butter, if you don't have a processed peanut butter and you put it in your cabinet, what floats to the top? The liquid, the oil, the fat. So that is tends to be liquid at room temperature. Okay. So again, to differentiate, you're looking at the number of double bonds, of course, one versus multi, so on and so forth. And we'll get into the omegas as we progress. Okay, so firmness, the degree of unsaturated influences the firmness at room temperature. We talked about that. Now, of course, with coconut oil, that's going to be, a major exception to the rule. That is a plant-based product. However, it has a whole lot of saturated fat. Now, the same is true with fat. not just one type of fat present in each of these foods. It's related to the proportion of those fats. So if you look at animal products, except for coconut oil, butter, beef tallow, palm oil, which is another tropical fat, chicken fat, you can see the first bar here is red. That's representing saturated fat, but you can see there's still monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats within those foods as well. You're just looking at the proportion, which one has the greatest amount of fats within that food. Does that make sense? Okay, that's why, or another factor as to why nutrition is so hard to study, because not one food just contains one specific nutrient. It can contain, lots of nutrients across the board. And you can see with your vegetable oils, like olive oil, canola oil, they contain a lot of monounsaturated fat, and then our polyunsaturated fats are going to be found in things like sunflower oil, soybean oil, walnut oil. I'm trying to say oil like 7 times fast. And then, so those are going to be your omega-6s versus omega-3s. So omega-3s are going to be found in things like fatty fish, as well as flaxseed oil. Who can tell me what some of the major differences are between our omega-3s and omega-6s? Which one has anti-inflammatory effects? Omega-3s, okay? Which one contributes to the production of arachidonic acid? Omega-6, okay? And we'll talk about the proportion of which we should consume these fats. Okay, phospholipids. So, we talked about phospholipids kind of making up the cell membrane of most of our cells. Of course, we have the hydrophobic component, the hydrophilic component, again, that's just showing us which ones repel water, which ones allow for water to come in and allow for the movement of certain solutes and things through the cell membrane. Oftentimes, phospholipids, like lecithin, are used in the food industry as emulsifiers in food. So again, just contributing to the texture of fats and how the body will actually use them, absorb them, transport them. Sterols, the most common one that you guys are probably familiar with is going to be cholesterol. Do we need exogenous cholesterol? The body can make all of the cholesterol that it needs. You do not actually need any exogenous cholesterol. So a lot of the fats, we're going to differentiate between which fats are dietary fats that have recommended limits, and we'll talk about some dietary fats that are essential, meaning that the body cannot make those specific fats. So cholesterol, our sterols can be derived by both animal products and plant-based products. Our plant stanols, obviously, stanols come from plants, and then sterols or cholesterol comes from animal products. We see a lot. How many of you all have read a Honey Nut Cheerios box and it says may help lower cholesterol? Okay. Do Honey Nut Cheerios help lower your cholesterol? No. Why does the box say that? Sales. It's not adding anymore. You're basically having Honey Nut Cheerios instead of biscuits and gravy. Okay, and the biscuits and gravy are going to be what, depending on the type of gravy, are going to be what contribute to added cholesterol. Does that make sense? And we'll talk about the difference between health claims, structure function claims, and things like that, what's acceptable in advertising and stuff like that as well. Okay, so cholesterol also found in the membrane of many of our cells. We make it in the body to produce things like bile acid. Bile acid is essential for the emulsification of fat, so it basically is recycled to help us digest the fats that we consume in the body. It contributes to the production of our sex hormones. Which sex hormones am I talking about? Androgens, testosterone, estrogens, things like that. Adrenal hormones, vitamin D, etc. The liver makes plenty of we'll circle back to this conversation as we progress. Okay, so digestion of fats as well as the uptake of dietary lipids. Fats are hydrophobic. They require enzymes for digestion. There are 3 primary enzymes that are going to aid in the facilitation of digestion of fats that we'll spend time on in this class. First of which is lingual lipase. Where do we think that's found? In the tongue. Yep. So that's going to be the enzyme in the mouth that helps with chemical digestion. So starches and fats, the chemical digestion of those 2 nutrients begins in the mouth. Protein is different in that it begins in the stomach. And then we have gastric lipase, which happens in the stomach and then is ceased in the stomach once you churn it and mix it with hydrochloric acid. And then we have pancreatic lipase, which helps to finalize the job once the bolus of food moves into the small intestine. So the ultimate goal, since most of the fats that we consume present as triglycerides, so that's a glycerol molecule, and how many fatty acids? 3, yes. So basically we're trying to dismantle those triglycerides. Now, remember with carbohydrates, when we had long chains of sugar molecules, we had to break those sugar molecules into their individual units, and then as soon as they were broken into their individual units, we could absorb them, right? It's a whole lot different when it comes to fat. With fat, we basically, and I'm sure Dr. Mahaney talked about this in the production of chylomicrons and micelles and stuff like that, but you take fats, you break them apart, but before you can absorb them into the cell, you got to make them into something else, which is a micelle, right? And see what you guys remember from biochem. Once you have that micelle, then it enters the enterocyte. Once you're in the enterocyte, then you have to do what? Break it apart, right? And then you build it into what we call a chylomicron. Once you have that chylomicron, then the chylomicron can leave the cell and enter circulation. But it doesn't go into the bloodstream. Where does it go? Lymphatic system. Okay? So fats are complex. Buckle up. Okay? We got a lot of things we're gonna have to talk about. So we want to emulsify those triglycerides and other lipids into what we refer to as our micelles. So that's going to be step number 1. If we don't have bile salts, then the fats are going to clump together and they're basically going to move through the system unabsorbed. Okay? Where fats are going to be our most complex nutrient to digest before we can absorb them, they're also the one that we see the most malabsorptive issues with, meaning like fatty stools, or stools that have a lot of grease and a lot of fat and a lot of oil associated with them because they're so complex to digest. So steatorrhea is the term that we use for fatty stools, just the fancy medical term. So lipase are going to be the enzymes that are going to digest or hydrolyze those lipids. Lingual lipase, again, is found in the tongue. It is present at about 34 weeks of gestation in newborns. It is the primary enzyme that's necessary for digestion of milk fat. It can digest other small and medium chain and some more complex chain fatty acids, but that is primarily what babies use to initiate the digestion of milk. Now, if you have any type of deficiency in your pancreatic lipase or your bile salts, so they're going to be produced by the liver, your lingual lipase can kind of kick it into gear and help facilitate with the digestion of other fats as well. And then, of course, gastric lipase is found in the stomach. It'll hydrolyze some short and medium chain fatty acids, but then the digestion is going to cease once you get kind of mixed in with the hydrochloric acid. Because remember, hydrochloric acid, which we haven't talked about yet in great detail, is necessary for the digestion of proteins. What are enzymes? They are proteins, so your hydrochloric acid is going to kind of halt the action of many of those enzymes. Okay, so as we kind of move from the system, or from the stomach specifically, and move into to our small intestine. There's an enzyme that's going to remove the fatty acids from our triacylglycerol or triglycerides. It uses a colipase, so just a cofactor protein that's necessary. So without this cofactor protein, which is a protein, we wouldn't be able to break apart this fat. So this is kind of hindrance number probably 4 in our ability to digest fat. So you have to have protein to be able to digest fat. So if you're protein malnourished, then that can influence your ability to digest fat. And we're going to see that again kind of as we move through this process. Let's see. The micelles are going to be what is produced, and again, we're going to come back to this, before the fat can move from the lumen of the GI tract into the enterocyte for the GI cell in the small intestine. Okay, so in the liver, the bile is made from our cholesterol. Those bile salts are going to be used to help emulsify a lot of our fat. Basically take that big globule of fat and break it into smaller pieces so that the enzymes can penetrate those smaller fat globules. Okay, so think about that in terms of putting oil in water. When you put oil in water, you get these like large chunks of fat, or the oil all binds together. It's attracted to one another. The bile salts are going to help kind of break apart that big ball of oil so that the enzymes there's more capacity, or they have more surface area to work with in those smaller globules of fat and oil. CCK is going to be a hormone that's going to tell the gallbladder to release bile. So remember, the liver makes gallbladder. The liver makes, oh, this just screwed up my question. The liver makes bile. What organ stores the bile? The gallbladder. Yes. Okay, so other way. What happens if you don't have a gallbladder?
You can't store it.
Can the liver store any of it?
The liver stores it a little bit.
The liver can store enough, yeah, to satisfy. You just don't want to have like 17 cheeseburgers and expect your liver to go ahead and break apart all of that fat. But, the recommendation, and we'll get to this as we progress again, the recommendation for people who have had their gallbladder removed, they can still consume fat. They might have a hard time with really high fatty meals, but overall, they can still digest and absorb fat as necessary. Okay, so CCK tells the gallbladder to release the bile, so the bile can start to work on or emulsify some of those fats. Most of the bile salts are going to be recycled back and reused, just like enzymes are recycled and reused as well. Okay, so this is just what that looks like here. The bile is, again, just breaking apart into smaller structures so that the enzymes can penetrate and take up more of that surface area. So once we have our micelle formation, our micelles contain things like cholesterol, our fat-soluble vitamins, bile acids, phospholipids, monoglycerides. They travel to the surface of those enterocytes, or the cells within the GI tract, and they will enter into the cell by way of simple diffusion. Now, the way that they enter the cell is going to be different from the way that they leave the cell, so that's important to note as well. Some free fatty acids can absorb, and small chain and medium chain fatty acids can absorb into the system without having to go through all of this process. And that's also going to be important for medical nutrition therapy. Okay, so our micelles, they are going to enter into the cell by way of what? How do they get there? Simple diffusion. And some of which do use specific transporters. And once they're in the cell, then we're going to work to break that cell, or break that micelle back apart into its individual units. So we end up with 2 free fatty acids and 2 monoacylglycerol that's going to recombine back into a triglyceride. So we just took that triglyceride and dismantled it, and now we have to basically build it back up again. Okay? This requires, or is activated by another coenzyme A, and this reformed triglyceride is going to be repackaged into what we refer to as our chylomicron. The chylomicron is This is just another area where if we don't have enough protein, then we cannot absorb or digest and absorb fats appropriately. So this, basically, apoprotein B48 is necessary to make newly structured chylomicrons. So again, another protein that's necessary for the recombination of this triglyceride. And I just highlight this because when you're working, like in the future, when you're working with patients who are protein or energy malnourished, it's not just gonna affect their body's ability to, make lean body mass and do all of these things, but it's also gonna influence their ability to digest and absorb other nutrients as well. So it just causes this cascade of events. Then, once we have our chylomicron, then we can leave, oh, excuse me, I forgot my water bottle. Then we can leave the cell and focus on transport. Okay, so we have our lipoproteins that are all packaged together in our chylomicron, or as you can see, kind of our chylomicron composition is going to be triglycerides, a little bit of phospholipids, a little bit of cholesterol, and a tiny bit of protein. And as these chylomicrons move through the system, you can see that the cells are going to take what they need to, and it's going to change the density of that lipoprotein that we've got as the cells take what they need from the structures. Are there any questions thus far? Not too bad because you had biochem, right? Okay, cool. Thank you, Dr. Haynes. He's so good. Okay, let's see. Chylomicrons used to transport our fats. They carry all types of fats. They carry our fat-soluble vitamins, so on and so forth. Within about 14 hours after absorption, the triglycerides have been depleted. The cells have taken what they need. We have very low density lipoproteins, or VLDLs. Those are made by the liver, transport various tissues to the body, composed primarily of triglycerides. Nothing too spectacular here, but again, as the cells kind of take what they need, it makes it more smaller molecule, makes it more dense, and that's what gives us our low density lipoprotein. So we went from very low density now to just low density lipoprotein. Still plenty of cholesterol here. Let's see. We want to remove our LDLs from circulation. What's one way that we can prevent our LDLs from being absorbed or kind of just stuck within the system? There's a couple of ways. What did we talk about last week that binds to things, both good and bad? Fiber. Yep. So if you have a high fiber meal with, a high fat meal, then that can bind to some of this fatty kind of contribution and pull it out of the system unabsorbed. Or reduction of saturated fat. Right? If you don't consume saturated fat, then you're not going to have these VLDLs and LDLs circulating, or as many of these circulating through the system in comparison to other types of fats. Our high density lipoproteins, or HDLs, that's going to be our quote unquote good cholesterol, right? So these are going to be the cholesterols that transport back to the liver for disposal and recycling. The HDLs made by the liver helps lower our risk of heart disease. Now, we'll get to this in more detail, especially when we get to our cardiac conversation. But if you think about LDLs versus HDLs, what is one simple way that we can increase our HDLs? Exercise, exactly. So exercise is going to help increase our HDLs. So say, for example, you have a patient that comes in and they have elevated total cholesterol. So they have high LDLs, maybe their HDLs aren't where we want them to be, and they start to exercise more. So their exercise increases their HDLs, right? What happens to their total cholesterol? It depends. go up and you don't do anything to influence your LDLs, then your total cholesterol is gonna keep going up, right? Because the total number increases. Now, what's the most efficient way to achieve a drop in your LDLs? Diet. Statins. Yes. Without having to turn to medication. So a reduction of overall saturated fat is gonna help, right? And then of course, things like weight loss, weight management, stuff like that, which comes with exercise. So you would suspect that if you're exercising, that you would see kind of an increase in HDLs and a decrease in LDLs. But just some food for thought, if you will. Okay, here is our lipid transport. Looking at those lipoproteins. I love this figure. It's kind of like cartoon and elementary, but I think it does a really good job of explaining how the LDLs and VLDLs are kind of moving through the system, which cells are utilizing components from them. It doesn't break apart like which cells prefer the cholesterol, which cells prefer the triglycerides, but in general, it does a really good job of showing us what is happening and how the body is recycling some of these fats that we have. Okay, so any undigested lipids in the stomach are going to delay gastric emptying. Again, it's pretty complex process in terms of penetrating that oil. Fat, a high fat meal is going to help us feel satiated for a lot longer period of time than a low fat meal will. It's the same thing if you were to drink an 8-ounce glass of whole milk versus an 8-ounce glass of skim milk. That whole milk is going to stick with you for a lot longer than the skim milk will. Let's see. Most of the fat that we take in is going to be absorbed into the lymphatic vessels before it enters into circulation. So fat is going to be the only nutrient that fat and fat soluble vitamins go into your lymphatic system prior to going into your circulatory system, whereas proteins and carbohydrates go directly into your circulatory system. Now, small and medium chain fatty acids, they don't have to be packaged into micelles and then broken down and then repackaged into chylomicrons for them to enter into circulation. Now this is really important because I mentioned that fats are going to be the nutrients where we see most malabsorptive issues with, okay? So if you've got a patient with fat malabsorption issues, we can basically prescribe small and medium chain fatty acids for them to take or include in their diet so that they can get the energy that they need from fat, they can get the calories, they can get the nutrients without having to undergo all of those processes. Does that make sense? Anybody here ever heard of MCT oil? It was a big thing people consumed or put in their coffee when the ketogenic diet was really big. And like you wanted to eat all of the fat, people would put MCT oil in their coffee. So there are foods and food items that have a greater amount of small and medium chain fatty acids that we can use to help bypass this process when people do have malabsorptive issues with fat. Okay, so what is the role of triglycerides? Provides our cells with energy. Of course, fat is a primary source of energy that we utilize. We can whenever glucose is not available, what's our preferred method to make glucose? What? Gluconeogenesis, yeah, but using fat instead of protein to do so, right? We don't want to use protein to make the glucose that we can, but we don't want to. And then of course we talked about some of those other functions as well. Okay, now getting into our essential fatty acids. So this is looking at omega-3s and omega-6s. So we talked about some of the different food sources. A lot of our nut oils like walnuts, peanuts, things like that, they contain a lot of omega-6s. And then things like flaxseed as well as fatty fish like salmon contain a lot of our omega-3s. There's overlap there in terms of omega-3s versus omega-6s. It's just looking at the proportion of which exists in each of those foods. So if we exclude fat entirely from the diet, that can delay our growth, that can lead to delayed nervous system development, it can lead to issues with our skin, and of course, depending on the severity, it can lead to death. Our unsaturated fats where we see, and this is, it should say plants and animals because we find omega-3s in those fatty fish products as well. But it contributes to the production of DHA and EPA, which are necessary for the nervous system. Okay, more info on omega-3. Let's see, this is our like anti-inflammatory component, whereas omega-6 helps with the synthesis of arachidonic acid. We don't really talk about omega-9 that much, but the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6 should be a 2-to-1 ratio. So we should be consuming more omega-3s in comparison to omega-6s. But the dietary intake in today's society is like 1 to 10 to 1 to 15 to 1 to 20. So we're consuming way more omega-6s than we are in comparison to omega-3s. Does that make sense? So more inflammation associated with that. Tends to, yes. Yeah. It depends on the rest of your diet as well, but the tendency is. Alright, any questions on that so far? Are you guys okay if I just boogie on through? We have 6 left. Okay, what are the dietary guidelines for fat? The AMDR, or the average macronutrient distribution range for fat, is anywhere from 25 to 35% of your total calories coming from fat. So this is age 2 and up, okay? There is no adequate intake, no EAR, no RDA that is set for fats. Oh, I'm sorry, well, yeah, we'll get there. It's really hard to determine how much fat we need because one, our body can make a lot of the fats and fat components and fat derivatives that it needs. And two, because many of the foods that we consume that have fat have all of the fats that we're talking about. So it's hard to get a good estimate on what that looks like. Now you can see that with our omegas, we do have, these are adequate intake values. These are not RDAs. So we do have adequate intake values for our omega-3s and omega-6s. But when we're consuming fats, we want to make sure to consume fats that are high in polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats. So this looks like lean meats, lean poultry, like eggs, nuts, seeds, plant-based things like that. We want our saturated fat to make up less than 10% of our total calories. This is total calories, not total fat calories. So if you consume a 2,000 calorie diet, you want less than 10% of that coming from fat, or saturated fat. And then trans fat is just best if you eliminate it altogether, but if you've ever had like a frozen pizza, you won't be able to do that. If you like anything that's just easily or conveniently prepared from the freezer, then eliminating all trans fat is going to be challenging. But minimizing it is really important. And then I love this recommendation. It just makes me kind of shake my head. Oils are anywhere from 3 to 11 teaspoons per day. That's a huge range of oils, right? And really you just have to look at the composition of what that oil is. So if you're using something like avocado oil or coconut oil, they have a lot more energy, like a lot of calories in, they're just more densely, or I don't know, it's just, it seems silly to me. That's just a lot, a big range difference. And then of course, so again, the difference between using something like coconut oil versus olive oil, that's going to be comparing the amount of saturated fat that you're taking in, so you're not going to be able to use as much coconut oil as you would be able to use olive oil. Does that make sense? Kind of balancing all of that. It's a lot to manage. And then of course, when you look at, other countries that primarily rely on coconut oil and coconut fat for cooking methods and consume a lot of coconut oil, they don't have nearly the heart issues and health issues that we have over in this country. So it's looking at, of course, like the composition of that saturated fat as well. And then daily cholesterol is, the recommendation is to stay at 300 milligrams per day. Now, is one of those nutrients that we can sit here and argue probably for the rest of class, right? Because we don't need any exogenous cholesterol because the liver can make what it needs. And typically, when people have heart issues, do they also have high cholesterol? Yes. But you can find numerous studies out there that look at people that consume only eggs, and it doesn't affect their cholesterol. Why? If you think about the other foods that contain cholesterol, what do they also contain a lot of amounts of? Not sodium. What type of fat? Saturated fat. So, is it the saturated fat or the cholesterol that's the problem? It is the combination, but again, if you look at those studies where people eat nothing but eggs and no other meat products, they don't have the same cholesterol issues. Yeah.
I might be wrong. I thought cardiologists typically recommend still watching your egg intake, or is that not really good? If you do have high cholesterol.
So studies would suggest that the eggs, the studies that have been done looking at egg consumption don't influence your cholesterol like people who consume red meat, processed meats, other foods that are high in saturated fat. So what that would suggest is that it's the saturated fat content in those foods that are contributing to the overall high cholesterol levels in those and the heart conditions, the heart issues. But when it comes to cardiologists and healthcare providers that are focused on maintaining the health of their overweight and obese patients, they want to recommend a reduction of cholesterol because that's usually a reduction of those other types of foods. They're probably not just chowing on 12 eggs a day. Does that make sense? Let's see. So the current American diet, excessive consumption of solid fats, excessive consumption of saturated fat, processed meats. So processed meats are things like hot dogs, sausage, lunch meats, already pre-cooked meats and things like that. Typically our blood lipid profiles look like really high LDLs, really high total cholesterol, and really low HDLs. So lots of fat content. That can also be influenced by processed carbohydrates. So processed carbohydrates can contribute to high total cholesterol, high LDLs, high lipid profiles, heart disease, cancer, and a lot of the cancer is not coming from necessarily fat intake. It's coming from obesity. So there's more than 25 cancers that are linked to obesity, and it's coming from the consumption of processed meats. So and red meats. So there is a relationship between red meats and processed meats and colon cancer specifically. And that's looking at the nitrites and preservatives in those foods. And then of course obesity as well. So the recommendations for changing your lipid profile we talked about. So reducing saturated and trans fat from the diet, physical activity, weight loss, weight reduction, of course avoidance of alcohol, choosing the right types of carbohydrates. The Mediterranean diet, anybody here heard of the Mediterranean diet? Okay, so it is different from the Americanized Western diet in that it looks at foods that, it focuses on foods that are lower in saturated fat, so more fish, more nuts and seeds and oils like that, very low in trans fat, lots of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fat, complex, fibrous, starchy carbohydrates, and then lots of phytochemicals, so lots of fruits and vegetables. I wanted to talk real quick on the recommendations for fat. You can see we do have an adequate intake value for the life stage 0 to 12. How in the heck do we know how much fat they need to grow? Their diet is very exclusive. So you can take the fat content of breast milk, match it to what they need in formula, and know exactly what a baby needs to grow and develop and mature at that year mark, then you start to include foods, and it's really hard to tell at that point how much fat they've gained. Okay, so our clinical implications. So of course, cardiovascular disease. We're going to hit on this hard in our cardiovascular conversation. Obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is unique in that it's kind of an indicator that there's other chronic diseases. You have to have like a specific BMI, you have to have a certain waist circumference, you have to show certain blood values or like sugar levels, and really if you have 3 or more of these certain requirements, then you're labeled as having metabolic syndrome. It can influence cognitive function if you're not getting in enough fat, and then of course can contribute to inflammation. Not only do omega-6s contribute to inflammation, but generalized obesity contributes to inflammation as well. And then of course autoimmune disorders. You guys will not have to memorize this, the lipid panel values here. If I were to give you a mock scenario of a patient and I gave you their values, I have to give you the normal range. So you would have to be able to tell me like, oh, that's elevated or not, based off of what the normal range value is that I give you. And that's true for VCOM as well. Okay, and then what are some of our modifiable and controllable risk factors for those conditions that I just said? I love to harp on and talk about physical activity. I think that is so very important. Of course, diet quality, whether you're looking at excessive intake, under intake, all of the micronutrients that are necessary, stress levels. How many of us in the room feel stressed? 3 people in this room feel stressed? I do not believe you. You are lying to
Constant
me.
state, so how do you tell if you're in a constant
Oh,
state?
so you're just at this plateau of stress? Yeah. I got the Aura ring for Christmas. Have you guys ever heard of this?
Yes.
This is the most like sad thing I think I've ever known. I'm like, your stress was engaged for 6 hours and 20 minutes today. I'm like, yeah, I'm not supposed to stay awake for 6 hours. Like, I had 32 minutes of REM sleep. No wonder I'm tired. Anyway, so if you want to stress out about your stress, get the Aura ring. And then of course, what's controllable? Diabetes,